Welcome to the People's Health Briefing, a component of the Trusted Voices campaign. I'm Dr. Noha from Ridge Community Health Center reporting for the week of November 1st, 2021. As health professionals rooted in Oakland serving some of the people most vulnerable to getting and suffering from COVID-19, we are here to cut through the noise to give you information you can use to make choices that will keep you, your loved ones, and your community as safe as possible. The goal of the People's Health Briefing is to empower you with our best knowledge and thinking every Tuesday morning. Alameda County has had 118,964 COVID cases and 1,432 deaths. That's up 17 from when I reported 1 week ago. In terms of vaccination, 84.4% of Alameda County residents 12 and up are fully vaccinated, and Oakland has 82.6% of its population 12 and up being fully vaccinated. And we are still seeing disparities both geographically and in terms of race, with Native Americans being the most fully vaccinated at 96.3% and African Americans being the least vaccinated at 66.1%. In terms of cases, cases overall do continue to come down, perhaps not as quickly as I would like to see, but we are at a decreasing 14-day case rate, but it's still about double what it was in June when cases were coming down pre-Delta. In terms of the Delta Plus, which is a subtype of Delta, which I reported on briefly last week, and we are concerned about this because it is increasing in the UK, and it does appear to be about 10 to 15% more contagious, although we still need more study on it. It does not seem to cause a more severe disease. It does not seem to evade the vaccine, but it does appear to be more contagious, so this is obviously going to be of concern. It also has two changes which are on the spike protein, which is something that we're always going to be wanting to look for because that is the part that our vaccines are designed against. And so this is something we're going to want to keep an eye on and want to see if any future mutations are going to arise. And since I reported last time when it had only been identified in Massachusetts, now 8 states have identified the Delta Plus: California, Florida, Maryland, Massachusetts, Nevada, North Carolina, Rhode Island, and Washington State, and DC. And we are only sequencing a total of about 6% of specimens nationwide, so we're not really sure of the overall impact, and so hopefully we will not be caught off guard yet again by a variant. And in terms of mask mandates, because recall that the mask mandates were lifted by the CDC right when Delta was just getting started, and it all sort of culminated in a much larger than expected Delta surge. So obviously that's not something we would like to see repeated again. So just want to update in terms of what is going on with mask mandates. And right here in the Bay Area, 8 Bay Area counties got together and came up with some criteria for lifting indoor mask mandates. And these are the 3 criteria that you would have to meet as a county for all 3 of them. Community transmission has to be moderate for at least 3 weeks. Hospitalization numbers have to be low and stable, and 80% of the total population has to be fully vaccinated. So now that is the total population, so not just the 12 and up, or 8 weeks have passed since COVID-19 vaccines were available to kids 5 to 11. Not too sure why it would be a time frame after availability of a vaccine. I feel a little more comfortable with just a percentage, the 80% of total population fully vaccinated, but nonetheless, that is the criteria. At this point, only Marin County has satisfied these criteria, and so the other 7 are looking towards that day. But in the meantime, Alameda County did ease some mask mandates in some settings, including basically controlled spaces that are limited in terms of who is coming in and where there are less than 100 people at one time. such as offices, gyms, commuting vehicles, churches, where kind of consistent groups of people gather on a regular basis. Everyone has to not have any COVID symptoms, and who's ever hosting, so if it's a business or the church, must verify that everyone attending is fully vaccinated. They also have to verify everybody's identity using a government issued photo ID. And of course, anyone who is not vaccinated is still required to wear a mask. Also, mask requirements are still in effect for public places like bars and restaurants and retail stores and schools and hospitals and clinics and adult and senior care facilities and on public transportation. So that has not changed. And as our Alameda County health officer, Dr. Nicholas Moss, said, if vaccinated people choose to continue wearing masks, they should feel comfortable doing so. And I know many of us will feel most comfortable doing so. Now I want to go over the FDA approval of the Pfizer vaccine for children 5 to 11 years old. And this was recently taken up last week by the VRBPAC, which is the FDA's advisory committee, and it is being taken up as we speak by the ACIP, which is the CDC's advisory committee. So we know that those are the next steps, and the CDC will need to make some determinations. So there will still be an update on this as to how exactly this is going to be recommended and how it will be rolled out. But I want to go over the actual trial information and what the VRBPAC had to consider. And essentially, just like every other age group and everything else we're doing, really, as it relates to COVID, it is about a risk-benefit analysis. And the risk-benefit analysis looks very different between different age groups. We know that in the older age groups, the risk of COVID itself is very, very high. And so it was essentially much more of a no-brainer in terms of the emergency need for clearance of the vaccine or the emergency use authorization. And in the 5 to 11-year-olds, there was some discussion as to whether this is considered an emergency for that age group. But clearly we know that this crisis is an emergency in general for the population. And so there are just so many sometimes competing factors that had to be really weighed out. So I'm going to do my best to walk us through some of those. So first, let's just talk about the actual impact of COVID-19 on this particular age group, which is 5 to 11 or up to 12 years old. So far, there have been 1.9 million confirmed and reported COVID-19 cases, and that's through mid-October, and 143 COVID-19 deaths in the U.S. through October 14th for this age group. And we think that the death and hospitalization kind of numbers are fairly accurate. The case numbers we do think is a pretty major underestimate. The 1.9 million confirmed and reported cases, we are sure, does not capture the many, many children who have asymptomatic infections or those who may get sick but not ever get tested. There also were 8,622 COVID-19 related hospitalizations through mid-October. And the hospitalizations for children in this category really are demonstrating some huge disparities, where in African American, Latino, and American Indian or Alaskan Natives are being hospitalized at about triple the rate of white and Asian children. And even when controlling for underlying factors, African Americans in particular are disproportionately impacted in terms of hospitalizations. So 8,622 COVID-19 related hospitalizations in this age group of 5 to 11, with major racial disparities noted. Also, there have been over 5,000 cases of MIS-C, which is the multi-inflammatory systems condition that really can cause inflammation in virtually every organ in the body. And in addition to Miss C, there is also just the post-COVID sort of symptoms that really can happen after any severity of infection. So we see that even children with mild cases of COVID end up with post-COVID symptoms that can be significant. They're very similar to the ones that we are seeing among adults: fatigue, headache, difficulty sleeping, difficulty concentrating, muscle and joint pain, persistent cough, and of course, physical and mental health challenges. And all of these can lead to decreased school and attendance participation that we are seeing. And these are all effects of COVID-19 itself. And we see that the 5 to 11 year age group is also starting to comprise a larger and larger share of new cases. We are seeing that even here in Alameda County as well. And when you go on the dashboard, you can look at any of these age groups that are listed here on the left. Just for purposes of illustrating, I am showing the 5 to 11 group against the 51 to 60-year-old group. And as you can see, the younger age group in the dark blue there sort of crossed over in terms of being comprising more of the cases sort of back in June, July timeframe, and has stayed higher than the 51 to 60 age group ever since. And this is, of course, in part due to the fact that the older age group is obviously getting vaccinated. But nonetheless, this is something that we are seeing nationwide, where the 5 to 11-year-olds are comprising one of the largest groups of new and recorded COVID-19 cases. So again, we know that that is still missing some of the COVID-19 cases. Long COVID, COVID hospitalization, and COVID death happen less in children than adults, but they still do happen. And in this age group, we have particular concern for MIS-C, and we also have particular concern for myocarditis, which can happen from COVID. It can also happen after MIS-C. So myocarditis, which is the inflammation of the heart that can occur from COVID, is of particular concern. Now, something that is important to note is that 1/3 of the children who are hospitalized for COVID-19 require admission to the ICU. So this is very significant for little children to be needing to go to the ICU like this. Also, 1/3 of children who are hospitalized for COVID-19 do not have any underlying comorbidities. So no underlying conditions, 1/3. So that's a very large share, especially when we hear all the time that, oh, it only affects you if you have underlying conditions. That is not the case. Remember that children who have asthma and who have obesity are considered to have underlying conditions, and those do make up the largest proportion of children who have serious outcomes from COVID-19. But a full 1/3 do not have any underlying comorbidities. So this is something important to note. So when we talk about the impact of COVID-19, we're talking about all the things I just mentioned in terms of the impact of the disease itself on children. So sort of the direct impact of COVID on this age group. But what the VRBPAC also considered in order to determine that it was appropriate to go for the emergency use was not only the direct impact of the disease on children, but also sort of the secondary impacts. So that includes the fact that children can and do transmit COVID. They can transmit it to one another. They can transmit it to adults. They can transmit it to people who are more vulnerable. And that, therefore, should this population be vaccinated, that would reduce the amount of transmission and in theory get us closer to a place of herd immunity. I think that that still just remains to be known. We don't know that for sure yet, but certainly it would get us closer to a place where more people are vaccinated. There certainly was discussion about the fact that relying upon children to protect those who are more vulnerable, which is adults, is a bit backwards in terms of how we typically think about these things. And so having children kind of bear the brunt of protecting adults is usually the reverse of how we think about vaccination. So there was some discussion about that, but nonetheless, transmission and trying to achieve herd immunity was certainly a factor that was considered in determining that this is an emergency. Also, the loss of in-person learning was raised as an issue, and the committee reviewed this slide here, which shows that there was over 2,000 schools that had to be closed at some point in time, affecting over 1 million children and over 68,000 teachers. And so this was said to be a significant factor as well in terms of deciding how important it is to get vaccine coverage for this age group. Now, in terms of the actual Pfizer trial itself, this was an 82-page document. They are the verb pack briefing documents for October 26, 2021. You can look them up online. You can download the entire packet and you can review it yourself. It is very detailed, and I know that at least with the adult vaccines, I kept hearing things like, well, I don't know what's in it, or I don't know, things that are in those documents. So I realized that it is a lot, but it is there. And so if there's any desire, you can certainly look up the actual trial data. And so, but I will review it here. So the first piece in phase 1, they do what is called the dose finding, and where they're trying to figure out what is the best dose. And what they tried the 30 microgram dose, which is the same dose that adults get, the same dose that 12 and up get. They tried 30 micrograms, they tried 20, and they tried 10. And what they did was look at the reactions that they got, and they determined that the 30 microgram was not acceptable in terms of how much reactions they got, especially local reactions. And they ended up determining that the 10 microgram dose was actually the best dose in terms of giving a response, an immune response, as well as having the lowest side effect profile. So that with that small group that they looked at, they determined that 10 micrograms was it, and that is what they used for the remainder of the trial. So they then went on to establish safety, and they started with a group of 2,250 participants. Out of those, 1,518 received the vaccine and 750 received the placebo. And they did this study from June to September, and that gave at least 2 months of follow-up time after dose number 2. Of course, we would love to have more than 2 months time, and we will have more than 2 months time. I'll talk about that in a moment. The FDA actually asked Pfizer to basically double the number of participants. So they did end up adding what they called an expansion group of another 2,250 participants in this age group, and so those were recruited into the trial later. And at the time of the data submitted for these briefing documents, the expansion group had a follow-up time of a couple of weeks. And so overall, we are talking about 3,000 children age 5 to up to 12 years of age that received the vaccine. So 3,000 received the vaccine, and this is what they were using to demonstrate safety and tolerability of the vaccine. Most of the adverse reactions, or anticipated reactions as I like to call them, occur within the first 1 to 2 days after receiving the dose, and they resolve shortly thereafter. So very much like adults. And the most common reactions were also very much like adults. They were pain or swelling or redness at the injection site, also fatigue, headache, muscle pains, and chills. So really just like what we saw in the adults. There were no serious adverse events associated with the vaccine or any adverse reaction that led to anyone withdrawing from the study. And so that was basically what they were able to determine from those 3,000 individuals that received the vaccine. Now, it's important to note that the trial is too small to detect the potential risk of myocarditis associated with vaccination because it's only 3,000 people. But in the peak age group, which is 16 to 19-year-old males, So 16 to 19-year-old males are where we believe that we are seeing the peak incidence of myocarditis from the vaccine. That is where it's the highest. The studies, there's some conflicting studies, but it may be around 1 in 7,000, 1 in 10,000, somewhere in that range. We're really waiting to hear more about that. And remember, this was not picked up in the trial of this age group either. This was something that had to be determined after it came out, and because it is such a relatively less frequent event, the study's just not large enough to pick it up. And so that is also going to be the case here. But with the peak being in the 16 to 19-year-old age group for myocarditis, and then when we look at the younger, the 12 to 15-year-olds, we see that the incidence of myocarditis from the vaccine is lower than the 16 to 19-year-olds. So when we then go down to the 5 to 11-year-olds, and the dose is 1/3 of the amount that the 12 to 15-year-olds are receiving, then we do expect it to be even lower. I think that that would be a reasonable prediction. But again, since the trial wasn't large enough to ascertain this, this is something that we would need to keep an eye on. And this is going to be happening in the long-term safety evaluations. They are going to be conducting 5 post-authorization safety studies, including a 5-year follow-up. And really, the 5-year follow-up is not because we will see something and say, oh my gosh, this happened 3 years later from the vaccine. No, that is really about, in the case that they do have something like myocarditis from the vaccine, they want to see how do those young people then do 5 years later. So once again, when we see adverse effects from the vaccine, those are all expected to be seen within about 2 months of receiving the vaccine, actually usually much less time than that. But in the event that there is a rare post-vaccination event like myocarditis, those are people that we are going to want to follow long term. And of course, we have to keep in mind and balance this against the fact that the risk of actually getting myocarditis from COVID-19 is much higher than it is from the vaccine. Also, we can see myocarditis from MIS-C, which is one of the later effects of COVID-19. So really, any way that we're looking at this, the risk from the vaccine itself is lower than from COVID. But again, we are unable to quantify it at this time based on just the studies. So that was the safety part. The effectiveness part really was trying to find out if the 10 microgram dose in the 5 to 11-year-olds is going to be effective for preventing contracting SARS-CoV-2 and from severe outcomes from SARS-CoV-2. And this also is difficult because most children with SARS-CoV-2 do fairly well, and so we actually did not see any deaths in either of the groups, the vaccine group or the placebo group. But so what they did was that they looked at this a couple different ways. One is something that I explained when we were looking at the trials for the 12 to 15-year-olds, which is called an immunobridging analysis, and they were able to determine through that comparison that the response that they were seeing, the antibody response that they were seeing, was statistically similar, or as they say, non-inferior, in the younger age group compared with the 16 to 25-year-old age group. They also did some more descriptive analysis in the 2,250 individuals in the initial trial group. And with all of that, they were able to calculate a vaccine efficacy of 90.7% against laboratory, 90.7% efficacy against laboratory confirmed symptomatic COVID-19. And this was at least 7 days after dose number 2. And this was during a time of primarily Delta variant. So this is looking at a time of Delta, which is important. And so that's the effectiveness. So we've got the safety, we've got the effectiveness. And one thing I think to note is that the formulation is a little bit different. The 12 and up vaccine is, again, it's 30 micrograms. It comes in a vial with a purple cap on it. For the kids, we've got an orange cap. So this is in order to make it easy for vaccinators to just easily, quickly distinguish. The pediatric doses have 10 doses per vial. Again, it's a 10 microgram dose. But the big difference, and there was a little bit of difference in terms of the buffers that were included in the formulation, and the reason for that is about the storage. So for the 12 and up vaccine, we have to store it frozen at negative 80 degrees Celsius. Or we can have negative 20 degrees Celsius for up to 2 weeks, and that's it. So we've got to store it very, very cold. With this new formulation, it can be stored in a refrigerator for up to 10 weeks. So that's kind of a major game changer, and that is what is going to allow this vaccine to be distributed to pediatricians' offices so that our children can actually receive their vaccine with their primary care provider, with their pediatrician, which is really a major improvement in terms of access, or at least that is certainly the hope. So the VRBPAC committee voted. They voted 17 in favor, 1 abstained, and 0 said no. So when it came right down to it, I think that the committee agreed that the benefits do outweigh the risk when taken in totality. And a lot of the discussion was basically saying that by having a broad yes, then it will be up to the ACIP and the CDC to say if they want to recommend it for everyone 5 to 11. Do they want to encourage it more for children with underlying conditions, and so on? And so basically the CDC can be more nuanced. They can be more restrictive if they would like to, but they have now the regulatory allowance, which comes with the FDA's approval. And so the next step will be to see what the CDC comes out with. One thing I think that is important to note is that several members of the VRBPAC did bring up concerns that by authorizing this, that mandates would be soon to follow, and there were several that felt that this would be a mistake at this point in time because we need more information. The things that really where we need more information, I would say, is with this lower dose, how strong is the protection? How well does it protect from contracting COVID, spreading COVID, reducing serious disease? Are we seeing any safety signals after it comes out? And that is something that we'll only know with time. And also, how quickly will that protection diminish over time? So how often will we need boosters? So these are all questions that we have, just like we have questions about the adult vaccine, and some things we aren't going to know until we have more time. And I think that it really comes down to, again, with that risk-benefit analysis, how at risk is your child of catching COVID-19? How much risk are they at doing poorly if they catch COVID-19? And how likely are they to spread COVID-19 to others, particularly those who may be at high risk? And so for those who, for example, still have children sheltering in, not going to in-person school, then perhaps those parents will choose to wait a little while and see if there is any safety signal or if there's more additional information. For those who are already in school and already go and visit grandma after going to school and so on, then this becomes a much more pressing question about getting those children protected, both because they're exposed and are at much greater likelihood of catching COVID-19, and also because they are more likely to spread it to someone who may have waning immunity or who may not do as well if they were to catch COVID-19. So I think just like everything else, there are things that we know and things that we don't know. And in terms of what we know, I think that the committee felt basically across the board that We don't know everything we want to know, but we know enough. We know enough to go ahead and make this authorization. And once again, we will be awaiting the CDC's determination on what the recommendations will be, because they absolutely, as we've seen in the past, can refine the recommendations. They can make some tweaks to it. They can use language that is very helpful for those who are making recommendations around the vaccine. Something like what we saw with the booster, where there are recommendations that say these groups absolutely should get it, these groups may get it. And so I think that we will all be anxiously awaiting what the CDC's updated guidance will be. And in the meantime, whether you are vaccinated or not, please avoid the spread of COVID-19 and reduce the impact of COVID-19 by getting tested immediately if you have any symptoms. Remember, these can include headache, these can include nausea, and so get tested immediately and avoid exposing yourself to others. And if you believe you were exposed, get tested in 3 to 5 days. And if you're positive, inquire about monoclonal antibody treatment. It is saving lives. Also, ask your close contacts to get tested and isolate as well. And if you are not vaccinated, then we want you to continue to protect yourself and try to delay catching COVID-19. At this point, it does seem pretty much inevitable that Delta will find you, and that really the vaccine is by far the most complete protection that you can have, and even that is not perfect protection. But it is at least the best protection that you can have, and significantly reduces your chances of getting COVID-19. But you can delay catching COVID-19 by avoiding traveling, avoiding gathering, avoiding crowded, poorly ventilated spaces, and wear a high filtration mask like a KN95 or N95 when you are going to be exposed to others. Also, reduce your risk of severe illness and death by please obtaining a pulse oximeter that you have at home. Establish your baseline so that when you catch COVID, you can monitor your oxygen for levels that may warrant going to the emergency department. Get tested right away after symptoms or exposure, and move quickly to get monoclonal antibody treatment if you are eligible. And remember the basics. Outdoors is much safer than indoors, and further away is safer than closer together, and a shorter time with others is safer than a longer period of time, particularly when you are indoors. This concludes today's People's Health Briefing. Thank you for joining us. Please tune in next Tuesday at 10 a.m. See you then.